saves Israel from a famine by causing the enemy army to flee and leave all their supplies behind for 4 lepers to discover. What happens next is most interesting but totally predictable. Hi, I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thank you for joining us as we study 2 Kings, chapter 7, verses 9 to 20 together. You'll remember that the 4 lepers were looting the tents that they found abandoned and hiding all the goods that they found there for later use. But their conscience got to them, and in verse 9 we hear them saying, quote, "We're not doing the right thing. This is good news, and we're keeping it to ourselves. We're keeping quiet about it," end of quote. The fear of being castigated also played a part in it, as they said, quote, "We have to go and tell the king now, for if we waited until the morning, we will indeed be punished." So back they went to the city gates and told the gatekeepers what they had found, and word eventually got to the king. But listen carefully to what the king, who got up in the middle of the night for all of this, had to say. In verse 12, we are told he said, quote, "Those Arameans, those Syrians, know we are hungry, so they left their camp and are hiding nearby. When we leave the city to get their supplies, we'll be captured and they'll get into the city." Well, evil men always assume evil, it seems. Perhaps the phrase, "it takes one to know one," could well apply here. Fortunately, one of the king's servants had an idea. He suggested that some men take 5 of the horses that were still alive, as they too would anyway otherwise die like the rest of the horses and the people if left in the city and the famine did its work. He said, "Let's do that and see what happens." And the king agreed, and he sent out 2 chariots with horses after the Arameans. Now, this mini scouting troop made its way to the camp and passed it to the Jordan, finding clothes and equipment along the way. Seeing that, they returned and told the king. We have no record of what the doubting king said in response, but verse 16 tells us the people went and plundered the camp. And more importantly that day, quote, "a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel," unquote, just as God had said through the prophet Elisha. Now we get to the more interesting part. Remember that officer that the king leaned on when he met with Elisha? Well, the king now appoints him to be in charge of the city gate, a humanly bestowed honor. But guess what? The people, in their rush to go out and get the food from the Syrian camp, trampled on him at the gate, and he died. Once again, just as the man of God had said. Let's stop there and dig deeper. First, we note that Robert Jameson explains why the lepers, telling their story to the gatekeepers in verse 10, first describe the cattle before describing the empty tents. He writes, quote, "The uniform arrangement of encampments in the east is to place the tents in the center while the cattle are all picketed all around as an outer wall of defense. And hence the lepers describe the cattle as the first objects they saw," end of quote. Charles Spurgeon related the realization the lepers had that they had to go and share the good news of what they found to one of the purposes for us in gaining the gift of life. He wrote, quote, "Surely Jesus did not come to save us that we might live unto ourselves. He came to save us from selfishness," end of quote. We should not be keeping our salvation a secret or hiding it in our coat pocket as an insurance policy in case of death. David Gusick adds, quote, "Since the lepers were not welcome in the city, they could only communicate with the gatekeepers. There were many people they could not speak to, but they were faithful to speak to the ones they could speak to," end of quote. Another great lesson for us. We can't all be famous enough to gain the ears of presidents and prime ministers and kings, but we can share our news with those that we have access to. Chuck Smith also wants us to not miss the unbelief of the king. He writes, "Look again at the tragedy of unbelief. Here God has provided, just like he promised he would, but unbelief keeps them from even partaking of God's glorious provision. End of quote. At least the king was reluctant and saw the whole thing as a trap. So many people are like that today when it comes to receiving the grace that God offers, especially when they're down and out. They see it as a trap and they miss out on the blessing. Let's not be like that. And let's share accounts like this with those that may easily fall into this other trap, that of missing out. On that point, Robert Jameson provides another reason why the king may well have had his suspicions. He writes, similar stratagems, leaving the tents and hiding in the forest, have been so often resorted to in the ancient and modern wars of the East that there's no wonder Jehoram's suspicions were awakened. Perhaps so. Matthew Henry on this point says the king, quote, knew he had no reason to expect that God should appear thus wonderfully for him, having forfeited earlier his favor by his unbelief and impatience. He knew no reason the Syrians had to fly, for it does not appear that he or any of his attendants heard the noise of the chariots at which the Syrians were frightened by. End of quote. The point, sometimes God works in ways and times and places that we are not aware of, but for our benefit. Through Elisha, God announced the exact prices in the Samaritan markets, and the prophecy was proven to be precisely true. We need to look for that happening over and over as we study the scriptures, but also as God speaks to us today. Finally, I can't help but note that when Christ returns, many, like the officer in this account, will know what's going on. They'll see it with their eyes, but they will not be able to taste the food. They won't have access to it. It will be too late for them. Henry quotes the book of Job, chapter 20, verse 23 here, and he says, when he was about to fill his belly, God cast the fury of his wrath upon him. End of quote. And Henry goes on to warn us of several things that he is certain of anyway. Number one, how deeply God resents our distrust of him, of his power, of his providence, and of his promise. When Israel said, can God furnish a table? The Lord heard it and was angry. His infinite wisdom will not be limited by our folly. God never promises the end without knowing where to provide or how to provide the means. When you and I distrust God, we're angering him. Remember that. Number two, how uncertain life and the enjoyments of it are. Honor and power cannot secure men or us from sudden and inglorious deaths. He whom the king leaned upon, the people trod upon. He whom the king leaned upon, the people trod upon. He who fancied himself the stay and support of the government was trampled underfoot as the mire in the streets. Thus hath the pride of men's glory been often stained. My take of that is, quote, if we feed our pride, we will famish our souls. We need to be careful that when men bestow honor on us, depending on what it is for and what it is, God may not be pleased. And number three, how certain God's threatenings or warnings are and how sure they are to rest on the guilty and obnoxious heads. Let all men fear before the great God who treads upon princes as mortar and is terrible to the kings of the earth. That's some good advice for us. Next time we'll visit the Shunammite woman once again that we studied in 2 Kings chapter 4. Join us for that, perhaps for a little different take. Until then, if you like what you're seeing or hearing, please indicate so. Thank you for those that have helped us reach the number of likes that we have, but also, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Digging for Scriptural Gems. Until then, keep on studying your Bible.